Good, says the man who led the revolt against Suharto.
Yeah, of course, there are still many homeworks which we have to overcome. But at least we enjoy freedom of the press, freedom of opinion, freedom of religion.
Indonesians are watching closely the developments in the Arab world. They know exactly how it felt to fight for that one thing they never had and will now never let go: freedom. Step Vasen, AlJazeera, Jakarta.
NASA's latest rocket launch has ended in failure.
3, 2, 1, 0, and ignition of the Taurus rocket with glory, monitoring how changes.
After a flawless launch, NASA officials say that the rocket failed to reach its orbit after a protective cover didn't detach. The satellite was meant to measure pollutants in the Earth's atmosphere to help scientists understand their impact on climate change, and now, of course, it won't. This is Al Jazeera. Adrian Finnegan with you here in Doha. Our headlines this hour: in Libya, opposition fighters are continuing to take on Muammar Gaddafi's security forces in towns across the country. Fresh fightings erupted in the western towns of AlJazeera and Misrata, and we're getting reports of anti-government demonstrations in the capital Tripoli, which is, of course, a Gaddafi stronghold. After Friday prayers, there have been more demonstrations calling for change across the Arab world, including in Yemen. Protesters in the capital, Sana'a, called for the end of the veteran president. And in northern Yemen, it's reported that at least 2 people have been killed during anti-government protests. Protests have also continued in Cairo's Tahrir Square. The new Prime Minister, Essam Sharaf, addressed the crowd and vowed to work hard to realize protesters' demands. He said that if he couldn't, he'd step down. In the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, protesters demanded improved services, better pay and an end to corruption. In the southern city of Basra, security forces used water cannon and batons against anti-government demonstrators. People in Jordan have also taken to the streets today. Crowds in the capital, Amman, have been demanding political reforms and a constitutional monarchy. A bomb blast has accompanied Friday prayers at a mosque in northwestern Pakistan. 9 people were killed in Nowshera district. The explosion happened as food was being distributed to the poor. There was no immediate claim of responsibility. Also in Pakistan, mourners gathered for the funeral of the former minorities minister Shahbaz Bhatti. Security was tightened around Islamabad's main church, where a funeral service was held. Bhatti was shot dead on Wednesday. He'd been calling for reforms to Pakistan's controversial blasphemy law. Taiwanese say that they feel threatened by China's plan to boost defense spending by some 13%. Beijing insists that it's not a threat to anyone, but the Taiwanese government is calling on the US to sell it more weapons. Japan and the Philippines are among other countries alarmed by the presence of Chinese warships off their coasts. In football, a well-known player has failed a drugs test and faces a 2-year ban. The Côte d'Ivoire international and Manchester City defender Kolo Touré had been suspended. The 29-year-old tested positive for a specified substance. Those are our headlines here on Al Jazeera. Stay with us. The news continues right after Riz Khan.
Hello and welcome from New York. When the Berlin Wall came down, he played a concert at the site of that Cold War-era barrier. But what chance is there that Roger Waters, the iconic founder of the rock band Pink Floyd, might perform where the West Bank Wall now stands? The rock star has been a long-time critic of Israel's policies in the occupied territories, and that has brought him controversy and complaints from Israel supporters. Human rights groups have denounced it as a tool for segregation, and the International Court of Justice has ruled that its construction is contrary to international law. Still, Israel insists the barrier is needed to keep out Palestinian suicide bombers and claims that the country is safer as a result. Palestinians see it as a way for Israel to steal their land and humiliate them, and to protect Jewish settlers in the occupied territories. So today we ask, do walls really work? And we get Roger Waters' opinion on why the international community continues to tolerate them. Remember, you can email or text us your questions and comments. Joining me now is Roger Waters, who has visited Palestinian refugee camps affected by Israel's wall. He sees it as an echo of the sentiment expressed in his hugely successful 1979 album, The Wall, and has called for the barrier to be torn down. Roger, thanks for your time. Now, I'll get your experience of walls in the Middle East in just a moment, but first I was interested to read how you came across a quote of yours from 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, where you questioned the value of telecommunications technology, and you were asking whether it would serve to enlighten us and help us better understand each other, or whether it would deceive us and keep us apart. Now, you said at that time the jury is out. Watching what's been going on in the Middle East, seeing these countries, the leaderships, autocratic and dictatorships, as people are calling them, falling, how do you regard that now? Is there any verdict?
Well, one hardly dares to be optimistic about these things, but it does seem as if the internet in general and sort of Facebook and Twitter in particular are accomplishing the end of allowing people, whatever their age and status might be, to communicate with one another across national and religious and ideological boundaries that was not possible before. So I'm horrified as I am by the bloodshed that's going on everywhere. I'm nevertheless encouraged by that fact.
Now, of course, you see the impact of music. You know the power of unity that can come from an iconic song, for example. Now, could you have expected social media to have this same kind of unifying force?
Well, yeah, and I said yes without thinking then, because I think at the time, if somebody had said to me, hey, look, we've got this great idea, it's called Facebook, and people send each other pictures of themselves and sort of, twit on about nothing to each other, and I would have gone, are you insane? I'm not investing in that. What a complete waste of everybody's time. So it just shows how foolish I may have been at the time. That's not to say that probably a huge amount of the time that people spend on Facebook is actually not socially constructive at all. It's just, it's sort of replacing gossiping over the garden hedge. But nevertheless, it has provided this extraordinary instrument that we are seeing taken hold. You talk about music. I just filmed a tiny clip 2 days ago for these kids called Blurred Vision from Canada, an Iranian group, or two of them are Iranian, I think, who had recorded my song Brick in the Wall Part 2. And they're relaunching it in conjunction with Amnesty International as a YouTube thing. So I did a, hey Ayatollah, leave those kids alone. And they're trying to get as many people as they can from all over the world to point their video cameras at themselves and say, hey Ayatollah, leave those kids alone, in order to protest the repressive nature of Ahmadinejad's regime. So that's extraordinary.
You actually have, more than 30 years on, you revived your iconic piece, The Wall. And I wonder what you see as its relevance to what's happening today.
Well, I hope you'll come to the show at some
to.
point. We're just about to go to Europe and do another 67 shows. So if you're in Europe, please come. The way the show is different than it was in 1979 is in 1979, when I did it with Pink Floyd, it was largely about Pink's personal story, and Pink's sort of 70% me and a little bit of Syd Barrett and a bit of a few